Newcomers to PC building may have a hard time trying to put a PC together. This video aims to help them by going step by step through how to build your own computer. Before we even begin PC, I want to show you what you're going to need for the entire time you build a PC, and then we'll move on to actually beginning to build.
The only thing that you'll actually need to build a computer is a Phillips head screwdriver. However, I also recommend that you use zip ties as well as a way to cut those zip ties, as that will help a lot with cable management. The only other thing we need to go over is grounding yourself. To ground yourself, simply touch the case a couple times throughout the build to make sure all your static buildup is discharged to the case. The first step when building a computer is to install the CPU. To install the CPU, we first need to open up the socket. To do this, we will use the small lever to the side of the socket. First, push that lever down to the side and then up. The socket cover will come up with the lever, which will open the socket up to place the CPU. From here, we want to align the CPU with the socket. There will be a small triangle on both the CPU and the socket that will tell you how they want to be aligned. These arrows will need to be matched when you install the CPU. Next, we should actually place the CPU into the socket. When handling the CPU, hold it by the sides and be sure not to touch the contacts at the bottom or the heat spreader at the top. Place the contact edge towards the socket and put those contacts on top of the socket. From here, wiggle the CPU to make sure it's fully seated, and the CPU should be flush with the socket and there should be nothing that sticks up. Once you've done that, it's time to secure the socket using the lever again. Push the cover back down so that it does not fall along with the lever. Push the lever back up so that the cover will clear the screw, and then push it down to the side and then back under where it's held. The socket should not come up or have any force with it. Now that our CPU has been installed, it's time to install the CPU cooler. There are many different ways to install a CPU cooler, so I will not be able to help you with this step. Instead, I will go over the basics of how to install a CPU cooler, and the rest you'll have to do using your CPU cooler's manual. The main thing you'll see with the CPU cooler is the installation of a backplate. You'll have to install this backplate to the back of your motherboard, and this will be what your CPU cooler mounts to. This next step is also used on every CPU cooler, and that is thermal paste. You'll have to apply thermal paste to your CPU before you install the CPU cooler. This thermal paste will interface between the CPU and the CPU cooler and will allow for better heat dissipation between them. Once you have installed the thermal paste, you can then install the CPU cooler along with its melting bracket. This next step is important to CPU cooler installation, as it can change how your thermal paste spreads across your CPU's heatsink. Once you have placed the mounting bracket, you're going to need to screw the mounting bracket down in what's called a star pattern or a cross pattern. Essentially, you're going to screw everything down little by little and in a certain pattern. Choose one of the screws to start screwing the CPU cooler down and do about 3 to 5 rotations. Then, switch to the opposite corner of that screw and do the same thing with about 3 to 5 rotations. Then, switch to the other corners of the CPU cooler with about 3 to 5 rotations. Switch to the exact opposite corner of that screw and do 3 to 5 rotations. Keep repeating this process until all of the screws bottom out and your CPU cooler has been successfully installed. If you don't do this right, you may pressure one side of the CPU cooler too much, which will cause thermal paste to incorrectly spread across your CPU's heatsink. Once all the screws have been bottomed out, it's time to put on the fan on the CPU cooler. To do this, use the clips on the side of the CPU cooler and clip one side into it and then clip the other side. Mount the fan appropriately so that the CPU fan connector will be close enough to the CPU fan header on the motherboard. Connect your CPU fan connector to the CPU fan header on the motherboard, that way your CPU fan will be able to communicate with the motherboard and receive power. I recommend hiding any of the excess slack from that connector under the CPU cooler. With the CPU cooler's heatsink mounted, the fan installed, and the connector connected to the CPU fan header, your CPU cooler has been fully installed and you can move on to the RAM.